Lake Superior, vast and unforgiving, with depths reaching over 1,300 feet and waves that can rise like mountain peaks, claimed the Edmund Fitzgerald and her 29 brave souls aboard 50 years ago on November 10th, 1975. We reflect, remember, and pay tribute to that fateful night when the ship was the pride of the American side, but the lake held her as its own in the gales of November.
A haunting chapter in the history of Lake Superior. On November 10th, 1975, amidst fierce storms that could churn the largest of the Great Lakes, the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished beneath the dark, cold waters of Lake Superior. As the waves whisper and the winds howl, we honor these souls lost, their story forever etched in the heart of the Upper Peninsula and beyond.
If you think about the Edmund Fitzgerald as a ship, this was a ship that was built to break shipping records. It was the pride of the American side, if we want to steal some lyrics from Gordon Lightfoot. This was a ship that was seen passing through the Soo Locks and passing places like Whitefish Point on a very regular basis. It was a ship that we saw passing here all the time, or I would say people that were paying attention would have seen that ship passing. So it was a pretty common sight, but it was a fast ship, it was well appointed. It really had a very well professional, well-seasoned crew.
The SS Edmund Fitzgerald launched on June 8th, 1958 at River Rouge, Michigan. A towering giant of the Great Lakes at 729 feet long and 13,632 gross tons, she reigned supreme as the largest ship for 13 years. Her iron heart carried the treasure of taconite from the rugged shores of Silver Bay, Minnesota, to the bustling steel mills of Detroit and Toledo, weaving a lifetime of industry across the lakes. But the story of what started on November 9, 1975, as a normal transport load of taconite from Superior, Wisconsin to Zug Island, Detroit, tragically became her final voyage.
The Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin, November the 9th, 1975, under amazingly good conditions, unseasonably warm weather, just very, very pleasant fall day. But weather forecasts were telling Captain McSorley on the Fitzgerald and Captain Bernie Cooper, who later ended up playing a role on the Arthur M. Anderson, that the weather was going to turn, which is pretty normal for that time of the year. November is very often the time of year that ships are getting into trouble on Lake Superior, much less the other Great Lakes at the same time. But they left November the 9th, Superior, Wisconsin, or at least the Fitzgerald did, fully loaded with iron ore, started heading across the lake, ended up passing Two Harbors, Minnesota. That's where the Arthur M. Anderson was emerging as they were passing that area. And those two ships, somewhat in tandem, ended up crossing the lakes together. I say somewhat because there were a number of miles separating them, but often they were within sight of each other. They were certainly in radio communications with each other. Again, Captain Cooper on the Anderson, Captain McSorley on the Edmund Fitzgerald. And they knew what the weather was doing. They knew it was going to get a little bit rougher. They weren't going to keep that unseasonably pleasant weather for too long.
Veteran sailors with decades of wisdom aboard the Fitzgerald chose a northern passage, hoping to navigate safely through the storms.
That would hug that Canadian shoreline to a certain degree, and that would give them a little bit of cover from the storm. And that's exactly what they did. They didn't have too bad of a ride crossing that northern part of the lake. But then as they started to turn and they kind of got into that northeastern corner of the lake, Slate Islands are kind of in that area, and they ended up turning, and they were heading more in a southeasterly direction, heading for Whitefish Bay.
And that's when something happened.
We don't really know what. What we do know is from the radio messages that Captain McSorley was sending to Captain Cooper and his officers on board the Anderson is that they had run into some trouble a little bit. They had a list. They had lost radar eventually. Fence rail was down. They had a couple of vents that were missing, and that was allowing some water to get into the hull of the ship. So, and that fact alone, I think that Captain McSorley putting that information out there, really so anybody could hear it, that I think tells you that they were experiencing some difficulties, certainly. But I'm not sure that anybody knew exactly how much of a problem or problems those different aspects were. Again, we don't know why this ship sank. The Fitzgerald had experienced some difficulties, and at one point when they were passing Michipicoten Island, Caribou Island, in his statement, Captain Cooper had made a reference to them maybe being a little bit closer. Not maybe, he thought they were a little closer than he would have wanted to have been to some of the shoals around Caribou Island. Not sure if that anything was, if that impacted the Fitzgerald one way or the other, but it is entirely possible that with the wave action, and at this point they were also experiencing bigger waves, the wind, the weather, the waves were hitting them at a different angle, more of an oblique angle at this point. It was really kind of beating the vessels up, more abuse than they had taken when they were more in that northern track, hugging that Canadian shoreline. So the communications kept going on. The Fitzgerald didn't have radar, as I mentioned before, so they were relying on the Arthur M. Anderson and the crew in the pilot house of the Anderson to kind of be their eyes, so to speak, using their radar. There were other ships out there that night. As a matter of fact, there were 3 foreign flag vessels that were coming upbound. They were not slowing down for the weather. They were going to head up into the lake, but there were also a number of other ships that were waiting in Whitefish Bay, just knowing that there were 20, 30, maybe 35-foot waves out there. And at the same time, at the Soo Locks, they were experiencing extraordinarily high winds. Some of them clocked up as much as 90 miles per hour.
Other issues were making it difficult too, like the lighthouse at Whitefish Point not functioning properly.
The switch that was to convert from the commercial electric to the generators that they had at Whitefish Point, the switch got stuck, and then so the lighthouse thus was not working. Whether that would have made a difference, probably not, but there were discussions about the light being out at Whitefish Point as well, between the communications between the Anderson and the Fitzgerald. So they're getting closer and closer, and then right around 7:10 p.m. on November the 10th, 1975, I think there's probably, at least on board the Anderson, there's a little bit of a sense of relief starting to settle over the crew, the captain, the people in the pilot house, that they're just getting this close to Whitefish Bay now. And once they would get into the bay, presumably calmer conditions. They would have, at that point, have fought their way through the storm, gotten into safer waters. A little bit of a sense of relief. But at about 7:10, a snow squall passes through some high winds. They lose visibility of the Fitzgerald. They had been able to see the lights of the Fitzgerald before that. But as soon as that squall lifted, and then they had some real clarity, one thing that was noted is they couldn't see the lights anymore of the Fitzgerald. And then soon after, they realized they didn't have it on radar at that point either. So I think no one could imagine that a 729-foot ship could sink that quickly, that they wouldn't have a chance to get a distress signal out. So they thought maybe there was some kind of a power problem on board the Fitz, that the lights weren't working, or maybe there was something going on with their radar. But as time passed, Captain Cooper started to get a little bit worried, a little bit more worried, and then he ended up radioing the Coast Guard and letting them know that he was very concerned about the steamer Edmund Fitzgerald, that it might have disappeared, it might have gone down.
This program is sponsored by the following.
Fitzgerald occupied a lot of my life. I heard about Fitzgerald when it sank, listening to a broadcast on a transistor radio because the power was off at the house. I was telling my young son shipwreck stories because I've been diving shipwrecks and he loved to hear them. And I said, if there's ever going to be a night the Fitzgerald or a ship goes down on the lake, it's going to be tonight, because we let kids out of school early that day. It was dark and stormy. Trees were being blown over. Actually, house trailers were overturned. The water was coming up over the lock walls and running down Portage Avenue. That's how bad the storm was. And I heard on the transistor radio that there was a ship in trouble on Lake Superior.
An air and sea search is continuing for possible survivors of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot ore carrier, which apparently broke apart and sunk last night on Lake Superior.
Aircraft sweeping over waters found a solemn anomaly 17 miles north-northwest of Whitefish Point, resting deep beneath the waves, the Edmund Fitzgerald's final resting place.
29 crewmen did go down with that ship that night. You really had to be a crewman that knew what he was doing, and to be that was quite an honor if you were someone like Captain McSorley to be captain of this relatively new, fast, very nicely appointed ship at that point. But if we look at the crewmen, just a few of the individuals that were on board, you had, like any other ship, you had different people from different walks of life.
Underwater expeditions have been conducted at the site of the wreck throughout the years, beginning with the Coast Guard's expedition in '76, the ROV in '98, and another in 1994. That same year, a controversial expedition on the Delta submarine uncovered a haunting discovery.
We did not expect to find a body. The Canadian government gives you a license to be able to explore. They told us you're not going to put a camera in any windows or any portholes, and we were good with that. The Coast Guard had been there, Jacques Cousteau had been there, the mini rover had been down for Seagrant, Whitefish Point, and Joe McGinnis went down, never saw a body, so we never thought that would happen. Lo and behold, our Delta submarine goes down. Right after my dive, I was number 3. The 4th dive was the owner of the tug and his son, who was going to write a report about diving the Fitzgerald. And it fell into their laps that this was the discovery, a man in a life jacket. And we knew we had to tell the government, we knew we had to tell the press, and we never went back to that site. And yet this ignited a firestorm of people who wanted to know about what was going on, and then people who told us you must not talk about what was down there. And that's been very difficult, even 25 years later, to talk.
This discovery made people closely tied to the Fitzgerald upset.
For 19 years previous, none of the men were ever recovered, nor do we ever believe they would be. And that just brought up a real bad sentiment inside of us. It was very emotional. Just the thought that somebody could venture down to the depths at the Fitzgerald rests with the men still being there and photograph and come back and sensationalize it. So my mother became a staunch advocate, along with Ruth Hudson from North Olmsted, Ohio, and Janice Armagoss from Madison, Wisconsin. Ruth had lost her son, Bruce, and Janice had lost her husband, Michael.
These families took action and had an honest conversation with Farnquist.
We met with him in 1994 after both his dive and the separate dive that discovered the remains had brought so much attention. We invited him to Mariners Church for the 19th anniversary and questioned him, kind of pinned our ears back and came at him with, why are you diving? What is the purpose behind it? We feel violated in this sense.
Told the world, which we promised we would never do on our 2 prior dives. We would never tell anybody. We found human remains, because that was the first thing the press would ask us, did you find any bodies? Did you find a cause for the sinking? And I said, well, we really didn't find a smoking gun, and no, we didn't find any bodies.
It was a devastating blow for our team, because we knew what this would mean to the families, and we knew that we were caught in a bad spot. If we never ever showed footage of it, people would say you never found it. It never happened. So it really challenged me ethically, and as a journalist too, you're like, well, how much do I talk about? What's news and what isn't? And when you have to ride that line, it's extremely difficult.
I felt like I was going in front of the firing squad. Why are you in the gravesite of my loved ones? And I explained, well, we have a museum 17 miles from the wreck site. Everybody that comes to Whitefish Point comes to ask about Edmund Fitzgerald. I said, we have a nice exhibit. And so I did suggest to families when they asked, is there anything on the wreck we could bring up to serve as a centerpiece for a memorial for their loved ones? I said, well, there's really only one thing, short of cutting half the pilot house off with a name on the side, which you could never do. There's a 200-pound bronze bell on top of the pilot house, beautifully engraved with Edmund Fitzgerald. Well, would you help us get it off? I said, that's not going to be easy.
The last and final expedition in July of 1995 raised the ship's bell from the abyss.
Lawsuits and people trying to stop us from doing it, but all the families rallied and really convinced Ontario, along with a letter that went to the President's office, President of the United States. And on humanitarian grounds, Jean Chrétien, Prime Minister of Canada, told Clinton, who was president at the time, we are going to allow the recovery of the bell on humanitarian grounds for the family members to serve as a centerpiece for a memorial at Whitefish Point, and that's where it is today.
The last dive that happened on the Fitzgerald, thereafter establishing legislation in Michigan protecting the grave sites of the bottomlands against photography and pressuring or putting pressure on asking. I think it took 12 years, the Canadian government, and specifically under the Ontario Heritage Act in 2006, finally came through and designated the Edmund Fitzgerald site an archaeological or heritage site, along with 2 other ships in their waters that offered that protection with specialized permits that are very restrictive, hefty fines for people who dive without a permit, and of course protecting the idea of photography being taken and released in a sensational manner.
An underwater sanctuary where peace must remain undisturbed.
It is an emotional story, and there was a loss of life here, and I think everybody can relate to that, losing a loved one somewhere, in their history.
The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald is not just about a ship lost to the storm, but by the families forever changed by that night.
He has always been on the boat, on the Great Lakes boat, from the time I can remember. He's really involved in his cooking, and he loves baking. He was always going to school in the wintertime to see how he can do different bake things. And he'd come back and he would teach me. I said to him, "How do you know if that spaghetti's done?" When he had put it in the pan. He said, "No problem." He took it out and threw a couple of them up on the wall. If it stuck on the wall, it was done. And that's how we lived our life. When we got ready to move, we pulled out that stove. It was like 20 pounds of dead meat.
This is Pam Johnson, who describes parts of her childhood in Toledo, Ohio, shaped by the legacy of her father, Bob Rafferty.
When his boat was coming in, he'd give us a call, and we would go up and spend the afternoon while they were either loading or unloading the taconite pellet and things like that. So it was an exciting time for me to get out and run. I'm 9 and 10 years old, and I run up and down this big old giant boat.
Rafferty was known across the decks as the steadfast cook aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald, a man whose seasoned hands fed sailors through the storms and calm alike. Though his time on the Fitzgerald was brief, having stepped in for another, he carried a deep respect for Lake Superior's unpredictable temperament.
It said, "Brooksy may be home by the 9th, however, nothing is certain." On the 9th. And then it sank on the 10th.
This voyage was meant to be his final journey before he hung up his sea boots and retired from the life he knew so well.
I was down in Georgia. We were in the Army. My husband was in tanks down there. And my mom called me one day and said she thinks that the boat that was being involved in was your dad's boat.
With 29 lives lost, 29 families felt that grief, like the family of Ransom Edward Cundy, a proud Yooper originally from Lake Linden and World War II veteran who sailed the Great Lakes for over 30 years, including about 8 years on the Fitzgerald.
He was a watchman, and commonly, watchmen during inclement weather and such could be seen in the pilot house to be another set of eyes, looking out on the horizon for other ships and other obstructions that could be on the water and such as well. When they weren't in the pilot house, they were working the deck with many of the other crew, ensuring hatches are locked down and making sure that maintenance is being performed regularly as well.
Darren was just 5 years old when his grandfather lost his life, recalling his last time seeing him.
We had a great time, and we actually got to go to an outdoor zoo that day, and it's a great memory. And we actually got to see him climb back aboard the Fitzgerald in the harbor and wave to him as he climbed and got on board.
And while he was young, he saw the pain it caused through his mother, Cheryl.
She really struggled with my grandfather's passing. She had lost her sister the year before, which weighed heavy on my grandfather as well, the last year that he sailed. And once this Fitzgerald sank in '75, she didn't have any closure. She had no place to go. She would venture up to Whitefish Point to the lighthouse before there was even a museum.
Something common many of these families have is to keep the memory alive.
So my part, I believe, I speak to schools, to kids. I believe my job is to keep our lives on and going for the men who lost their lives. And I talk about it almost every day. I sing the songs. I probably drive people crazy. But it's my role, I think, to give information to how good he was and the rest of them too. I just wanted to tell my story.
She liked to go into elementary schools in Marquette County, and there's even letters from a class in Oklahoma. She had a lot of notoriety because she was very outspoken, especially when dives started really taking place. It was the pride of the American side, the queen of the lake, the men that sailed it. It was almost felt to be a special privilege. I think the best of the best. And get a sense, that these are real men. The dedication, the sacrifice that they have to do. But imagine how hard it is for them, to work and be away from their families and to sail those rough seas in November.
Few songs have captured the soul of a moment like Gordon Lightfoot's The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. His haunting lyrics not only memorialized the tragedy, but brought the story of the ship and her crew to the world's attention, ensuring that their memory lives on.
I think you can't not recognize Gordon Lightfoot and his contribution. That song that came out in 1976, number 2 at one point on the Billboard Hot 100, which is kind of unusual for a song like that. That's a kind of a longer song, and it's not, if you think of the 70s and you think of music at that time, we're thinking of disco and we're thinking about a lot of other more upbeat, fast songs.
But The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald didn't really fit that mold. But yet, it was a captivating song, and it still resonates today.
Some people have made the comment, oh, well, Gordon Lightfoot, he made money off of that song. He made money off of the loss of those 29 men. But I think people that make comments like that don't really understand what he was doing with the song.
After having seen a Newsweek article where the name Edmund Fitzgerald was spelled wrong, replacing the U with an O, Lightfoot wanted to bring this real tragedy to light.
He had grown up in Aurelia, Ontario. He had grown up, he spent time in Toronto. He saw these ships coming and going. And I think he kind of felt like that story of this ship and crew kind of got the short shrift. And so he had ended up writing that song. He wasn't seeing this as, oh, how much money can I make off of writing this song? I think, again, if somebody looks at it that way, they're missing the point here.
Before Lightfoot's passing in 2023, he met many family members of the crew throughout the years, as all that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons and the daughters.
And when Gordon Lightfoot come along, he so changed our lives immensely. And I had a chance to meet him. He was here in Kansas, and I got tickets, and I asked her to go backstage, and they said yes. When I got there, they put me in a room in a red table, and I said, how come everybody else is over there and I'm at the table? And they said, well, he's coming to you first. So I sat down. I'm nervous. I don't know what he's going to say to me. I put my hand down on the table. He put his hand down on mine. He looked at me with a tear coming down his cheek. And he said, I know. And that's all he had to say. He knew that displeasure I was having by having a father who had just died, and now he's singing a beautiful song about it. That's why I love Gordon Lightfoot so much. He did that for me when he said, the old cook come on deck. That was my dad he was talking about.
And the lake, it is said, never gives up her dead. Lake Superior remains as powerful and unpredictable as ever, a reminder of nature's might and the respect that it commands. Though the ship rests silently beneath the waves, we honor and pledge to keep their stories alive for generations to come. I'm Rebecca Bartelme, and thank you for watching.